This presentation, made in August of 2018, is for those United States residents who are interested in traveling from the U.S. to Cuba on Southwest Airlines, especially those people who wish to travel independently in Cuba. In other words, not traveling with the hand-holding of a U.S.-based tour company or cruise line. This presentation addresses concerns that people have when traveling by air their first time. The first is, when and how do I declare my U.S. General License category? And 2, how do I obtain a Cuban tourist visa to enter Cuba? I'll also discuss a couple of other pieces of Cuban paperwork that you will come in contact with. One point to get out of the way first is that tourism to Cuba is prohibited according to U.S. regulations, and it has been that way for decades. Even under the loosening of travel regulations to Cuba under the Obama administration, tourism was still prohibited. So how do you legally get there? Well, travel to Cuba, according to U.S. regulations, is allowed for certain pre-approved reasons. As I detailed in my April 2018 video, I believe that the support for the Cuban people general license provisions to be the most flexible for independent travel to Cuba. So, to the U.S. government, you're not a tourist to Cuba, but a traveler to Cuba. On the other side of the equation, to the Cubans and to the Cuban government, you're just a tourist. And to enter Cuba, you must buy a Cuban tourist visa. And on Southwest Airlines, obtaining your Cuban tourist visa is a non-issue, as I'll explain. By way of background, you book your Southwest flight to Cuba exactly like you would a flight to anywhere else. You can complete the entire booking process online, and about the only difference in terms of data entry is having to include your U.S. passport number, its expiration date, and if you actually have one, a global entry number. When I go to Cuba, I check my bags at BWI's international ticketing desk, not the domestic ticket desk. When I leave from BWI to Fort Lauderdale, I do not have my Cuban tourist visa on me. Although I could buy my tourist visa online, there's really no reason to bother and pay the $35 premium to do it online. Also, I think there's a very long form that you have to fill out when doing it online. I always buy my Cuban tourist visa in Fort Lauderdale, which is what you see in the pictures. In Fort Lauderdale, at the departure desk, there is a little side podium and a representative marked A in the picture. You walk up to the young lady, give her your U.S. passport and credit card. She charges your credit card $50. Other than pleasant conversation, she doesn't ask any questions about your travel to Cuba. At least, she's never asked me any questions. She's just there to sell you a $50 Cuban tourist visa, and you're done. That's it. A 2-minute $50 credit card transaction with the nice lady behind the podium, and you're in possession of a Cuban tourist visa. There are just 5 basic pieces of information called for on the visa. Your U.S. passport number, name, birth date, nationality. Again, this is a Cuban government document. This Cuban visa has nothing to do with the U.S. government and the general license category that you will soon self-declare. Just be careful when filling out this visa. You will put the same information in pen on both the left and the right side of the perforated visa. Don't make a mistake. Supposedly, if you make any kind of correction, it will be rejected when you get into Cuba at the Cuba Customs desk, and you'll have to pay another $50 to buy a new one. So be careful. So after you buy your Cuban tourist visa, you then step 3 feet to the right and hand your Cuban visa and your U.S. passport to the Southwest gate agent marked B. That gate agent doesn't do anything to your tourist visa. In fact, it doesn't even need to be filled out. The agent is confirming that you have a Cuban visa. He does not stamp it or fill it out for you or do anything to it. He or she is just confirming that you have one so that Southwest knows that you can enter Cuba once your flight reaches its destination. Now, this is when you self-declare your U.S. General License category. Up to this point, after booking your flight on Southwest.com, in the weeks and the months you've waited to travel to Cuba, you've never had to say why you're going to Cuba. You've never written it down or confirmed it to anyone with the U.S. government. But here, as you are checking in for your last leg to Cuba, the Southwest gate agent will look up for just a moment from the computer and ask you, what is your reason for travel to Cuba? You respond, support for the Cuban people, or respond with whatever general license category is appropriate for you. The gate agent looks back down and keys your answer into Southwest's computer system. Now, this is the point you may worry for just a moment about the disconnect between the U.S. government question the Southwest agent just asked you and the Cuban tourist visa that you just bought and handed to the gate agent. The Cuban visa says tourist, but the reason for travel to Cuba, as far as the U.S. government is concerned, can't be tourism. Tourism is not one of the 12 U.S. general license reasons for travel to Cuba. But do not worry about this disconnect between the two governments. No one cares. You've answered the U.S. government's question put to you by the Southwest employee. That said, after you respond verbally to the reason for Cuba travel question, within Southwest's ticketing system, it recorded your self-declared general license category for travel to Cuba. It is very highly unlikely, but in theory, up to 5 years after your trip, someone from the U.S. government could send you a letter saying, years ago, you self-declared your Cuba trip as support for the Cuban people. We are now asking that you provide us with information and documentation to show us how you met the requirements of that travel category. Again, I want to emphasize that such an audit is highly unlikely, but you should understand that your verbal self-declaration is your record of how you are self-authorizing your travel to Cuba. So if you're going to Cuba to sit on the beach for a week and work on your tan, and you're not interacting with any Cubans and not spending any money with any private business owners in Cuba, well, that would probably be inconsistent with the U.S. government's approved reasons for travel to Cuba. Okay, so you've self-declared or self-authorized your reason for travel to Cuba, and the gate agent is just about to hand you back your U.S. passport and Cuban tourist visa. Then the Southwest agent reaches back to the little edge marked C. They grab 3 additional documents and they hand everything back to you. These 3 additional forms are also needed for your trip, but are pretty easy to fill out, and you, along with everyone else in the flight, will be filling them out when you get on the plane. It gives you something to do during your short hop into Cuba. You won't need these forms filled out till you get to Cuba. In fact, one of them isn't even a form. It's actually just a card, which I'll explain. The Southwest gate agent hands you 3 documents in addition to handing you back your Cuban visa and your U.S. passport. Forms 1 and 2 are Cuban government forms. Number 1 is a Cuban Customs Declaration form. Among other things, you're attesting to the fact that you're not bringing into Cuba any weapons, narcotics, live animals, pornography, and several other things. You're also disclosing any electrical appliances that you're bringing in and whether you have over $5,000 in hard currencies. You're going to need your U.S. passport number to complete that declaration form. Form 2 is essentially your current health situation. You're attesting to the fact that you're not suffering from any fevers, rashes, vomiting, or that you haven't been around anyone with such symptoms over the last 15 days. The form asks you also to disclose where you're staying on the island, so have your Airbnb address, hotel info, or at least some telephone numbers to write down when filling out that form. Documents 1 and 2 you hand to specific individuals at the airport upon your arrival. Document 3 you'll want to keep with you for your trip. It's a Southwest Airlines card indicating that your health insurance was paid at the time you booked your tickets, and should you get ill or injured and need to go to the hospital during your trip, there is contact information should you need help. So again, this card you should keep with you during your trip. For the first couple of times that you go to Cuba, I would suggest that you ask the Southwest gate agent to give you a second set of these documents, because you're bound to make mistakes when filling them out, and having an extra set with you also for your next trip to Cuba certainly makes things a little bit easier. So you want to go to Cuba and you'd really like to have someone there to set up some tours or just talk to and get general recommendations for things to do. Well, you can call my tour guide on the island, Jose. Jose, his wife and kids live in Havana, and he's handled all my trips and can accommodate individuals and groups for something just as simple as picking you up at the airport or walking tours around Havana, and he can even do full-blown tours across the island or bicycle tours down in Santiago de Cuba. Practically anything that you'd want to do, he can make arrangements to take care of. Jose is an independent tour guide on the island, so hiring him is consistent with the activities that are called for in the Support for the Cuban People General License category. I've recommended Jose to my friends and coworkers for their trips to Cuba, and I have no reservations about recommending Jose to you. Only don't try and schedule him for the first week of November 2018 and the first weekend of January 2019, as Jose's already booked with me and some guys from my office. Other than those dates, go right ahead and call. Before we close out this video, let's just recap things. Traveling to Cuba on Southwest Airlines is a breeze. You can book the whole trip online, and about the only difference between going to Phoenix versus Cuba is that you add in your U.S. passport information and, if applicable, your global entry number. Remember that you can buy your Cuban tourist visa out the Southwest Gate. It's really that simple and is a 2-minute transaction. Note also that you self-declare your general license category you're traveling under verbally at the Southwest Gate before you get on your final leg to Cuba. So really, please go to Cuba. Enjoy it. It's an interesting place to go.